Today we're going to be going over one of the most basic joints in woodworking, the miter joint. Let's get cutting. Hello, welcome to the shop today. Today I'm going to be talking about miter joint and doing actually a dive into how to construct miter joints using not only power tools like the miter saw behind me, but also table saws and a variety of hand tools. We'll see how each one of these goes along. We have a variety of equipment around us that will help us along our way. We have, for one, we have the compound square. This will allow us to adjust some things, but it also gives us a really great guide for a 45. So that's going to be a great tool we're going to use a lot. This is a miter box. This is, as you know, when you're constructing miters, something that's called a miter box. Seems like it would be up your alley, right? So we're going to be showing how to properly use this. These are super cheap and can be picked up at most hardware stores. Not super precise, and I'll show you a little bit about the way that these can go wrong. But if you want a quick and easy way to make a miter joint, then this is a great option for you. And then we're also going to be using a variety of different hand saws. So this is considered a dovetail saw. It's a Japanese pull saw, but this one also has a backbone on it that actually makes the blade nice and rigid and firm. And this is another Japanese style saw. This one is made by DeWalt. I haven't been super pleased with this in the past, but it's a tool that I have available to me right now, and it's readily available at most hardware stores. So I thought I would give it another try today and see how it progresses and keeps up with the rest of these saws. And then this is just a regular Western style saw. This is considered a back saw. So this has a nice backbone to it, really rigid blade, so it keeps really nice and straight. Thicker than the Japanese style saw blades, but this one's actually thinner than a lot of Western style saw blades. This one cuts on the push stroke as opposed to the others that are cut on the pull stroke. So I'll use this one as well to show some comparisons between the different types of saw blades. So miter joint, we use it in all kinds of things. We can use it in boxes. We can use it in picture frames. Rather large picture frame I was making for a panoramic picture a while back. So the miter joint here. But lots of different applications. You can find these all over in different types of furniture, waterfall edges on countertops, and just tabletops in general. So there's lots of different applications. They can be relatively strong if the grain is directed in the right way. Miter joints aren't known to be the strongest joint, but they can be made a lot stronger by adding things like splines on the joint. Here's another version of a spline. This one's actually hidden inside the joint, so you actually don't see it except for the edge. But splines go a long way to actually creating extra strength. And you can orient your miters in two different ways as well. You can orient them with long grain going side to side like this, with obviously a 45 cut in there. So it's long grain on long grain. Or you can orient them like this, where it's short grain to short grain. The long grain to long grain is going to be stronger than the short grain to short grain, but most people find that the short grain to short grain creates this nice continuing line of grain all the way around that most people find very aesthetically pleasing. So that's the way you most commonly see it, and also that's the way most boards are oriented, where the long dimension of the board is going to be following along the grain, so it's usually you have more material to work with to create a box in this orientation. So that's the way you most commonly see it. You never would see a joint where it's long grain to short grain. That definitely would never happen. and should never happen because the way the wood expands, this is going to want to separate these two pieces away from each other. Okay, so I'm going to start off with showing you how to cut them on some of the power tools. Probably going to be the simplest way to do this, but most of you aren't going to have this available to you, but I want you to know that, like how to actually go about this if you get your hands on some power tools. All right, going to move to the miter saw first. So this is the first time I'm using the miter saw with the class, so I just wanted to point out a few aspects of this. So it works on a pivot. Some of them actually will just pivot straight down. Some of them are going to be what's referred to as a sliding miter saw. That means it's going to pivot and pull straight back as well. But whichever one you're using at any point, you want to have it up away from your material before you actually start it up. And you'll want your material to be flat on the tabletop and also pressed up against the fence. So this part back here is the fence. The cutting zone is over here. And you can see on here there's a little image of a hand being chopped off, or not chopped off, being crossed out right here. So the idea is past this line, you're getting into the danger zone. So you want to keep your hands away from there if at all possible and never get it even remotely close to in the realm of the blade. If you're cutting anything that's a little bit smaller, then you're going to have to think about other strategies, about maybe using a clamp to actually clamp something down as opposed to getting your hand that close to the saw blade. Always remember to when you're making a cut, you bring the saw down. Your finger's not on the trigger yet. You bring the saw blade down, check to make sure that the line is where you want it to be. You bring the saw blade back up, then you start the saw before you make your cut. The reason why you start it before you make the cut, or before you make contact with the piece of wood, is because if you turn this on while it's in contact with the wood, there's not enough RPMs at that point to necessarily cut the wood, but there is enough to grab the wood and throw it. So most of the time when someone has a dangerous accident on the miter saw, it's all about starting it before it cuts down. The reason why we're talking about the miter saw is because, as the name suggests, it gives you good miters. It's not the most precise tool in the shop because there's lots of adjustments that can get slightly out of whack, and depending on how you're holding your wood and like just a lot of other variables, sometimes you get your miters slightly wrong. But it's a really good quick way to make a miter, and if everything is lined up and the stars are perfectly aligned for you, then you can actually get one that you can be really happy with. Sometimes I'll use these if I'm doing a whole stack of picture frames or something like that. Then a miter saw is just absolutely great to have. You most commonly see them in on like job sites in construction, because a slight, a tenth of a degree or something like that, it isn't going to make a huge difference when you're framing up a wall or something. You can correct that. But for doing fine joinery, sometimes it's not as applicable. And there's two different ways you could get a miter on here. You could do it by adjusting the angle of the saw blade, so you can adjust it like this, and the miter, most miters anyway, have a little registration point down here, and you bring it over to the 45 degrees, and then there's a handle that you push down to lock it into place. You can do it in either direction, so you can get a 45 over here, 45 over here, and you choose to go in either way orientation just by how you're positioning your wood, and whether you want just wanting to keep yourself away. Like if I was to try to cut my 45 over here, then standing over here, this is going to put me in much more danger of getting my hand caught in the saw blade. But if I have it in this direction, then I have a lot more room to maneuver around without getting my hand near the saw blade. So that's important. I already have my lines drawn, but I accomplished that by knowing that I wanted this piece to be 6 inches. So I went ahead and moved my compound square, set it at 6 inches, set it up against the end of my board, drew my line, and then with the compound square, where I have a 45 degree angle already established, I brought this over, lined it up with the edge there on my mark at 6 inch line, and then went ahead and drew that. And I'm putting that reference point here because even though my blade is set at 45, I wanted something to line it up against, so I knew exactly where I wanted it to be at. And I will probably go ahead and set up a stop block on this saw so I can get two cuts exactly the same. A stop block is another new concept for this class. And a stop block can be pretty much almost any scrap of wood. A lot of times I end up using this, which just holds my pencils on this table. But I'm going to use something a little bit smaller because I don't want it to get in the way at all. So I'm just going to use a square piece of wood like this. I'll put it angled this way. Okay. So now I'm just going to line up my saw blade where I want it to go. Remember, finger off the trigger of the miter saw as I'm bringing it down. So I'm just lining up my board with the miter saw, getting it together. So this is going to give me a pretty good idea of exactly where I want it to be. The only trick with this is that you have to be firm with your grip on holding it in place. You could also clamp it down, but you also want to make sure it's really flat up against the fence when you're doing this orientation of the board. If you're doing a picture frame and it's laying flat up against down against the table, then that's a little bit easier to go about. But when you're doing something a little bit taller like this and you're trying to get the 45 in this orientation and this crosscut, crosscut is cutting against the grain. So you're going against the grain, a crosscut. When you're doing something like that, you just have to make sure it's pressed firmly up against the back of the fence of the. And what this stop block is going to do for me is it means that after I do this cut, and then I bring the board back over again to this point, and I do another cut, I know that those two pieces of wood are going to be exactly the same size. That way I know that both of my sides are exactly even. That's really handy for when you're making multiples, or if you are doing parallel sides in like a box, which is part of the demo that I'm going to be making today. All these are going to be little boxes, or partial boxes. I'll explain more here in a little bit. But so I want two parallel sides that are completely even, and that's important. So a stop block goes a long way to getting that pretty darn perfect. Okay, notice one of the things that is really important with that cut, especially when you're using a stop block, is when you do your cut and you bring it all the way down, you need to make sure that you release the trigger and the blade comes to a complete stop before you lift it back up again. And the reason for that is this piece of wood, it's got nowhere to go over here. So if you're actually do your cut and you have a stop block set up, a lot of times if you don't have a stop block, that piece of wood will shake a little bit and go a little bit further away from your saw blade. But if you do have a stop block, then there's nowhere for that piece of wood to go. So it's going to stay pressed right up against that saw blade. So if you bring this saw blade back up, if it's shifted just a tiny bit, it might catch the tooth of the saw blade, and this could get caught and thrown and end up any number of places, or just explode into splinters. So it's always good to do your cut, release the trigger, and wait for it to come to a complete stop. So now I have two miters that are the same size for the pieces. So two same size miters. These are for the sides of my box. I only need a miter on two sides. I'll show you why. It's not a box, it's a shelf. I don't know why I keep calling it a box, because it's kind of box shaped, I guess. But I did both of those at the same first because I didn't want to have to remove my stop block yet to get my side. So now I have this 45 already established. So now I need another 45. I want this length here to be 22 inches. So I'm going to measure that off and then draw a line. Sometimes you need to be more precise than others. For this shelf that I'm building, I don't care about precision all that much. And one of the most common mistakes people end up having with a miter saw is you do this cut, you get your 45, and then you move this forward, and then you do another cut. But now this 45 is going to be going in the opposite direction. So this one will want to line up this way, and the other side will want to line up going the opposite direction, which is no good. So when you're doing this, you have to actually flip it back around so your 45s will both be facing in the correct orientation. Now, to line that up, I'm going to use my handy dandy compound square again. I'm going to line that up with a mark that I just made. And continue that line up and over. So now I know where I'm going to be at. And to give myself that 45, just so I can have an easy way of finding where my saw blade should be sitting, I'm gonna go ahead and draw a 45 here too. Perfect. All right, I have my two 45s on this board that I want. Line this up. One here. One here. So there I have a beginning of the project that I have in mind for today. I never like to make sample joinery just for the sake of making sample joinery. So I always like to have a reason behind things. So yeah, I'll show you what I'm making a little bit later. So that was the miter saw. Most of you, like I've said, are probably not going to have access to that tool this quarter, but I wanted you to know what was happening with it. Alright, and that does a pretty good job. I could see a tiny bit of space when I go to actually hold this up. I think it did a pretty good job. One of the reasons why I don't like the with the miter saw is if there's any sort of twist or warp in your board, especially if you're cutting a little bit of a longer length of board like I was just doing, that can show up in the miters that you make. So you really have to make sure that you have really flat stock. But that's true with most of these cuts. Most of them you're not going to be able to correct that way. Okay, so that's the first cut. Let's move on to, I think, the table saw next. Today, we're going to be using the table saw for the first time. The table saw is one of the workhorses of the wood shop, and normally you would be encountering this all the time, but unfortunately with, you know, apocalypse and all that, you don't get access to it. But anyway, I'm going to show you how to cut miters on this. To begin with, there's two different orientations that you can use the table saw in. You can use it for rip cuts, where you're going to be cutting along the grain of the wood. So that's when you're following the grain of the wood, that's considered a rip cut. And with that, you use the fence. And here is our fence right here. So to do rip cuts, you line it up on the fence and do your cuts this way. I'll do more demos and point out more things when we actually need to do a rip cut, but we do not need to do a rip cut today because I am going to be doing miters on here, so we need to do a cross cut. So with a cross cut, you need something called a crosscut sled. So a crosscut sled gives you a solid base to actually operate on, to actually hold your material firm and flat while you pass it through the saw. This basically serves as the fence, just on a mobile surface. The other way you could do this is with something called a miter gauge. So, as you can imagine, a miter gauge is meant for cutting miters. I just don't normally encourage using these in the shop unless you have something really specific in mind, because this only gives you one point of contact as opposed to this entire surface here. So this it takes a little bit more skill. It's easier to get your cuts slightly off if you're using the miter gauge. But the one nice part about this is you can adjust your angles and lock your angles in. So you're not only just limited to a straight up and down, like a normal 90-degree cut, you can also bring it over to all kinds of different degrees. You have anywhere from 60 degrees to 0 degrees on here. So you have a lot of different options with a miter gauge. But we're going to be using the crosscut sled today. And crosscut sleds in the shop usually are set up for two different types of cuts. Some are going to just have a up and down 90-degree cut on there, and you can know which one is which because there will be a line just cut straight up from the saw blade where only straight cuts have been passed through. This one has a 45-degree cut as well. So that's the way I know that this crosscut sled is perfectly fine for cutting 45s. I don't want to dive too deeply into all the different parts of the saw stop or any table saw right now because you don't have access to this. So it could be just information that's going to flow over your head if you don't have actually the ability to use these saws right away. So I don't want to make you think about this too much until you actually could physically touch it and work with them. But just a few things I want to just point out quickly. I have two different on switches with this one, actually three on switches, but the third one always stays on, and that's on the back side. I only turn that off when I'm actually doing any work on the saw, actual maintenance on the saw. This one has on switch right here, so it has this turns on, and this is priming the motor. So this is starting up. You can see this light flashing. We don't ever turn this on until this light has stopped flashing. And then to turn this on, I'm pulling this switch up. This is a paddle switch. A lot of contemporary saws have paddle switches. And the reason why contemporary saws are typically installed with these is because it makes a lot safer way to shut it off. You don't have to fumble around for a little switch on the saw to turn it off. You have this entire paddle, so once you're ready to stop a cut, you can just hit it with your hand. If you're cutting on the saw and your hands are occupied, you can hit it with your knee. It's really easy to turn it off. That's handy. We have two wheels on here as well. One adjusts the height of the saw blade, which we always want to raise the saw blade up higher than the piece of wood that we're cutting so the teeth have room to bite into it. And the other wheel is for adjusting the angle of the saw blade. So we have a degree finder right here, so it shows degrees from 0 to 45. I'm loosening the center knob right here over on this side. That releases the wheel so I can actually turn it. And so now I'm going to give this a turn. I'm going to bring this all the way over to 45 degrees. And that should be about where we want it to be. So now I have two of these constructed in two different ways. So I have first one done on a miter saw, this one done on a table saw. Both accomplish the task perfectly fine. Typically, the table saw is my preferred method. I feel like I can get a little bit cleaner lines, but all of these look pretty good to me. So, cool. Now I'm going to move on to the next method of creating a miter saw. Not a miter saw, a miter joint. I'm going to move on to a miter box and use some hand tools for you. Another thing about a miter box is you want it to be secure if you're going to have any chance at all of getting a straight cut. You don't want it to be dancing around. So typically, that means lightly screwing this onto a surface If you do not have a tabletop that you're willing to drill into, then what I recommend is getting a scrap piece of wood, screwing a miter box into that scrap piece of wood, and then having that clamped down. That can work as well. And I do say screw it down lightly, because this is plastic, and most of the miter boxes that you find nowadays are going to be plastic, and consequently they're going to want to actually bend if you put too much pressure on them. They could even break. So you don't want to screw it down so tight that it's going to actually change the angles that you're working with, because it does have that flex to it. So cheap little thing, but you have to be careful with cheap little things. All right, and you can use this with a variety of saws. You can see right here another one of the issues with this. The gaps in the guides here are going to be a little bit on the loose side. So you can get relatively good cuts with this, but it's more for non-precision based work. There we go. That didn't take too long. And now we have two 45s that match up to give you your wood a 90 degree. There's a tiny bit of spacing right here that I'm seeing, so that's probably a little bit of a wandering of the blade. And it looks like it kind of shifted around right here too. You can see, maybe you can see a little bit of a gap right here. So not quite as precise as what the power tools were. Now let's do a different variation of that. We also have a 45 not only running in this direction, we also have a 45 on the miter box that is running in this direction. Another thing to note about the miter box is you can't take full cutting strokes either, so you can't use the full part of the blade, because you don't want to take it all the way out of the guide, because then when you bring it back through you might misalign it. So you really have to take shorter cuts. So it takes a little bit longer to cut most of your cuts. You can also clamp this down onto the fence here on the miter box. You can clamp it down, the stock that you're cutting, but I'm not going to do that right now. It's usually easier to angle your saw a little bit to get your cut started. So you can see how I have it angled. And then I'm going to straighten it up as I progress into the wood. Almost through. Okay, another 45. That lines up pretty well. Okay, so that's using a cheap little plastic miter box. Okay, so I have all my miters cut for this project. I'm going to go ahead and line up my straight edges together and then run a piece of tape along both of the edges, and this creates a temporary connection point to hold them lined up. So now you can see the two miters facing each other. This allows us to be able to fold this straight up, so it brings the miter in just the way I want it to and gives me that nice 90-degree angle. At this point I can go ahead and glue this up, and then I can go back through and put in my if I wanted to anyway, I could go back through and put in my keys or splines, and I'm planning on doing that with these, but I'm going to go ahead and glue them up first. But that's just for demonstration purposes to show you how to fold these up right now. But for what I'm making, I'm going to go ahead and do a few more cuts. I am going to have two rails going across the front of this, going across the entire length, and these are going to be connected by lap joints. So before I actually go about gluing it up, I'm going to go ahead and cut the lap joints. So we covered a few different ways to make a miter joint. The ways that I'm most comfortable making a miter joint, and I feel like are most successful in making a miter joint, are with power tools. So that's using the miter saw or the table saw. Those are going to give you the cleanest miter joints. Using hand tools is completely possible, especially if you have a jig or a miter box to assist you with that. But for longer cuts like that, it's going to be significantly more difficult. And other joinery is going to be so much easier to do with hand tools for something that's a little bit wider like this. It's always really interesting trying to figure out how to do certain things with hand tools that are so easy with power tools. And then there's things that are pretty easy with hand tools that are a little bit more complicated with power tools. So you kind of have to look at the different type of joinery that you want to make and decide whether it's worth it to pursue something like a miter joint, which isn't the strongest joint available to you, or just moving straight ahead and going ahead with a dovetail or something like that, which is a little bit easier to do with hand tools than it is with a variety of different power tools. Okay, thank you very much, and next week I'm going to go ahead and finish this off, and I'm going to have kind of a bonus lap joint demonstration, because it's not going to be as long as this video, but I need some lap joints to finish off this project. So I'm going to go ahead and record that as well, and I'll post that later on, probably next week, and so you can see how that finishes up. All right, thank you.